Perhaps more than any other major Hideo Kojima release, 2019's Death Stranding has proven exceptionally divisive. From Metacritic bombings to low sales, the game, on the internet anyway, has become a subject of widespread scorn and derision. Thanks to the all-too-common social media practice of dunking on the unpopular, Death Stranding has become in many people's minds little more than a mockery. According to this widespread narrative, this game is shallow, boring, and little more than a Monster energy drink commercial combined with an excuse for Kojima to hang out with his celebrity friends. So how can it be that I claim this same Death Stranding is actually a clever, deep, gripping experience that stands out as one of the greatest sci-fi games ever made and a very important contribution to the medium at large? Let's find out. Formally, Death Stranding is a new style of action-adventure game, one that ties together a bevy of heretofore unrelated genre strands, from survival horror to the RPG. Where this newness gets expressed the clearest and starkest is in terms of the controls. In essence, Death Stranding fundamentally rethinks the relationship trinity, if you like, connecting the player, the controls, and the environment. If other games made combat against enemies the focus, Death Stranding shifts this conflict onto a struggle with the environment. The various tools and techniques you gain across the game are, first and foremost, about the environment, and how you'll go about traversing it in all its myriad forms. What many of the game's staunchest critics miss is that, while Death Stranding may entirely revolve around one essential kind of task, deliveries, that doesn't mean there isn't any depth or variety. A big consequence of how the game's designed is, to a much greater extent than other games, what you get from Death Stranding is often a function of what you're willing to put into it. There's an art to being a porter as much as there is a science. So if you choose to tackle every order exactly the same, that doesn't speak to the game's failure of imagination, but your own. What's intriguing about how this environmental emphasis has been received is it epitomizes a huge double standard within gamer culture, one that arguably Death Stranding set out to critique. Masses of players don't complain when the newest big FPS contains nothing but shooting, because they aren't being forced to step outside their comfort zones to play it. Yet, if say Doom Eternal can still be a masterpiece despite involving nothing but an endless stream of the same basic thing, then Death Stranding could be too. The only real difference that's relevant here is while Doom Eternal or Half-Life Alyx are comforting returns to something familiar, yet new and more high-tech, Death Stranding commits what's become almost cardinal sins in this industry. It tries to be something completely new, and it takes its time doing so. Now, it's crucial to admit outright Death Stranding all but invites the scorn that it's received. The game speaks in a fourth wall breaking and ironic way to the very idea of video game culture, largely by subverting expectations well beyond the average player's interest in or patience with to even perceive. What is the fundamental orthodoxy of this medium? Escapism. Often enough, people play games to just pass the time, to escape from themselves and their reality. This is precisely the central tradition that Death Stranding sets out to subvert, replacing it with a combination of two things that games rarely foster: alone time and altruism. The first thing that struck me about Death Stranding is how empty it feels. But as I played, a whole new approach to game worlds emerged, one that even over 100 hours later continues to change and evolve and surprise me every time I play. What some have maybe missed is the game world is just a baseline, a foundation, empty as it is, that the player base collective are in charge of building on. What may be truly revolutionary about Death Stranding as a response to online games and modern technology is how, even though it's still a single-player game, it allows a genuine kind of society to emerge that, unlike any other game before it, is generated collectively, dynamically, and non-determinately. In MMOs, players form societies by things like trade, PvP, or running quests together. That means the social order, so to speak, isn't really made up by players, but by systems that they take part in as their proxy. Death Stranding, meanwhile, despite not requiring a subscription fee, is more of a shared online experience, I'd argue, than any MMO. Why? Because it gets rid of the intermediary systems and menus and binds the strands of the players together directly through a form of altruism, through changes, collective improvements to the environment. Instead of helping you on a quest where we both gain XP, or trading with you so we both get an item or an amount of currency, in Death Stranding I help you without realizing it, and not just you but everyone that my fabrications reach by the changes that I've made to our shared space of the environment, or by delivering lost packages that wind up in my world, or many other possible ways. So the idea Death Stranding is shallow or repetitive, or yes, even empty past a certain point is, I'd argue, a false one. Players who give up at the start will never know the true depth and brilliance that this experience has to offer, and it's their loss. Another emergent source of depth in Death Stranding goes back to the controls. I've rarely felt such a dynamic sense of growth and self-mastery as I did over the course of playing. Death Stranding starts slow because playing it kind of requires relearning even basic elements to video games like how to walk, jump, and run. But as a result, over time, rarely has a game given me this measure of control and conversely, this level of possible mistakes to be made. Why? Well, usually, given the central mechanic in a game often relates not to the rope but to the stick, in other words, to fighting, how you move and perform actions is the one thing that typically has to be easy. The challenge is either against an enemy or against yourself. It can't really be both. Yet most games, with some important exceptions, automatically opt for the former and not the latter. Because Death Stranding does opt for the latter, and by doing so functions as a critique or reevaluation of gaming norms, it leans hard on the less popular approach. What results, given you give it the requisite time, commitment, and patience, brings a growing sense not of mastering your opponents, but mastering yourself. Death Stranding is an experiment in self-knowledge, in genuine self-actualization and growth. After long enough, you'll breeze past tasks and obstacles that once almost destroyed you. You'll learn things about the game and about yourself that can be learned but never could be taught. It's the experience, in other words, that really counts, really distinguishes the adults from the kiddies here. That really gives the game meaning. But since none of this is immediately evident, because it builds on what's come before while playing it, many players have given up on Death Stranding before it has even properly begun. For those of us who stick with it though, Death Stranding gradually unveils some of its true intentions, which include subverting and ironically commenting on not only gaming culture, but modern society as a whole. Unlike many of Kojima's games, which explicitly take themselves apart by the end, Death Stranding never really fully connects all its dots for you the way it did, say, MGS1 or 2. What I mean is that, like always, the wool has been draped over your eyes, but unlike always, Death Stranding never spells out its deceptions fully in a comprehensive, totally coherent way. The player is relegated to only strands of the deeper narrative, which fold in on themselves and evade a clear-cut explanation even to the very end. There is a story there, mind you, but it's buried and dispersed and threaded over and under the entire game, which strongly emphasizes the wider emotional tone of loneliness, apathy, and confusion, of longing for a connection, an explanation, a truth. However, what's less obscured is how Death Stranding cleverly comments on gaming culture, just like Hideo Kojima games always have. In explicit response to 2016's Battlefield 1 and Call of Duty World War II, two sequences in Death Stranding take the player into nightmare versions of both world wars, where war has changed to lose all meaning or substance, lost even the meaning of life and death, lost all meaning except itself, becoming a pointless recurring war for war's sake. It's the ultimate takedown of the worst elements of modern gaming culture, yet an empathetic one. We see a similar idea expressed in yet another referential sequence, where the boss battle against the gamer personified Higgs descends into a pastiche of 2019's Mortal Kombat 11. And the American-led fixation with superheroes is a major point of reference for the entire game, given that you and everyone else resembles one kind of tragic superhero or another. The central conceit, meanwhile, of reconnecting the country along a so-called chiral network seems to speak to some of the deepest and most profound questions facing the modern age. Like its major cinematic ancestors Blade Runner and 2001: A Space Odyssey, Death Stranding questions what it will mean in the near future to remain human as technology increasingly shapes our societies, our health, our epistemology, and our way of life. Death Stranding also responds to the decline of the American empire throughout the early 21st century, while, like virtually every Hideo Kojima game, threading in strands taken from World War II. The UCA, United Cities of America, resembles, at least in some regard, the pale specter of Nazi Germany, if not only as its sort of chiral afterimage. The character Die Hardman is the literal embodiment of the German Totenkopf, which began as a symbol for the SS's love of danger and difficulty, but wound up symbolizing the Holocaust. Speaking of, the game's incinerators are a nod to the concentration camp crematoriums, where the Nazis, like bridges in the game, were keen on disposing evidence for their own wrongdoing. There's even a chiral version of the shape used by the Nazis' paramilitary group, the infamous SS, flipped on its side to signify, in Death Stranding, ceramics. Even elements of gameplay and setting in Death Stranding feel like subtle nods, in some ways, to Nazism, given the Aryan myth was about a place back in antiquity too cold and indomitable for all but its native race to endure. The Nazis reveled in difficulty and in being diehards. Yet to survive, they not only all but destroyed German culture, they committed industrialized mass murder on a historic scale, and started yet another, even more pointless world war. So don't mistake the Nazi imagery and allusions as somehow veiled endorsements. To the contrary, Death Stranding is drawing a satirical connection between what became of Germany between the end of World War I and the rise of Adolf Hitler, to what the US arguably has become between 9/11 and the election of Donald Trump. Instead of any one ethnic or religious group, however, bridges in Death Stranding, like the dark rumors about London Bridge that the game brings up, have built their new order on the bones of the young and defenseless. It's eventually revealed that the chiral network you've been building runs on so-called bridge babies, by harnessing their power to bridge the worlds of the living and the dead. This requires brain-dead or so-called still mothers who, like the BBs, are treated by the system and its social norms, much like the suffering Jews were who slaved away in concentration camps, as subhuman instruments, or freaks, and nothing more. Behind this facade of embracing challenge and struggling to exist, just like the Nazis who could not or would not accept their nation's defeat in the First World War, the leadership of the UCA are in deep denial, while their whole society from the ground up continues to run on lies. They refuse to die, so they become, again like the Nazis, the walking dead. Each member of Bridges can't let go of a very literal link with the land of the dead, and in their senseless grief and refusal to relinquish control or face reality, they've all but killed the entire world, and enslaved the entire future, which is symbolized by the mechanic in the game known as timefall. Death Stranding clearly deals with a bevy of very heavy subject matter, from the rise of the so-called doomer generation to the gig economy, petropolitics, and climate change, the rise of crypto-fascism, not to mention the newest, and maybe the game argues, final mass extinction event. But all these topics and themes, gripping and contemporary as they are hidden deep within the somewhat drug-addled, spiritually numb surface level, far beneath the popular bash campaign against the game's capacity to perceive. In closing, Death Stranding is nothing short of a masterpiece. It's just a misunderstood one. If you haven't already, give it another shot. That is, if you have what it takes. Until next time, boss.